Think you know everything about classic Hollywood musicals? The 1959 film adaptation of Porgy and Bess holds some of the most bizarre production secrets in cinema history. From a suspicious fire that destroyed everything to a film so controversial it's been locked away for decades. These shocking truths will change how you see this legendary but elusive masterpiece. Fact 1. A mysterious $2 million fire halted production. Just 2 days before the full cast dress rehearsal was scheduled to begin, disaster struck the Porgy and Bess production in the early morning hours of July 3, 1958. Shortly after 4 o'clock in the morning, a massive fire broke out on the soundstage, completely destroying all of the elaborate sets and costumes that had been carefully constructed for the film. The damage was catastrophic, with losses estimated at $2 million, which would be worth well over $20 million in today's money. Everything that had been built for the production was reduced to ashes in a matter of hours, forcing the entire production to shut down immediately. What made this fire even more disturbing were the rumors that began circulating almost immediately after the blaze was extinguished. Whispers spread throughout Hollywood that the fire had been deliberately set by black arsonists who wanted to shut down the production entirely. These rumors suggested that some people were so opposed to the film being made that they were willing to resort to sabotage and destruction to stop it. Producer Samuel Goldwyn quickly went public to denounce these rumors, calling them baseless and inflammatory. He insisted there was no evidence to support the arson theory and urged people not to jump to conclusions about the cause of the fire. However, despite Goldwyn's public statements defending the production and dismissing the arson rumors, many studio insiders told a different story behind closed doors. According to people who worked at the studio, there was a widespread belief among those close to the production that the fire had indeed been set deliberately. The timing seemed too convenient, happening just before the major dress rehearsal, and the complete destruction of everything suggested something more sinister than an accident. The production was forced into a 6-week hiatus, while sets and costumes were painstakingly rebuilt from scratch. Fact 2. The original director was fired mid-production. The director's chair for Porgy and Bess became the center of a major behind-the-scenes drama when producer Samuel Goldwyn made the decision to hire Rouben Mamoulian, the very same director who had helmed the original 1935 Broadway production of the opera. On paper, this seemed like the perfect choice, since Mamoulian knew the material intimately and had already proven he could bring it to life successfully on stage. However, what should have been a smooth production quickly turned into a nightmare of creative disagreements and clashing egos between the experienced director and the notoriously difficult producer. During the 6-week hiatus following the devastating fire that destroyed all the sets and costumes, tensions between Mamoulian and Goldwyn reached a breaking point. The two men found themselves in constant conflict over virtually every aspect of the film. From the visual design to the casting choices to how scenes should be staged and shot. Mamoulian had his own artistic vision for how the film should look and feel, while Goldwyn wanted complete control over his expensive production. The arguments became so frequent and so intense that Goldwyn ultimately decided he couldn't continue working with Mamoulian and fired him from the project entirely. To replace the fired director, Goldwyn brought in Otto Preminger, a filmmaker known for his strong personality and ability to handle difficult productions. What made this replacement even more remarkable was the fact that Preminger was already deep into pre-production work on 2 other major films at the time. He had been actively preparing both Anatomy of a Murder and Exodus, 2 projects that would eventually become significant films in his career. Despite these commitments, Preminger was willing to set both projects aside and delay them, because he saw the opportunity to direct Porgy and Bess as too important to pass up. Fact 3. Sidney Poitier's voice was dubbed by Bobby McFerrin's father. When audiences watched Sidney Poitier perform as Porgy in the 1959 film, they weren't actually hearing his voice during the musical numbers, even though it appeared to be coming from his mouth on screen. Because Porgy and Bess was based on an opera with demanding vocal requirements that needed trained operatic voices, the filmmakers made the decision to dub Poitier's singing with the voice of a professional opera singer named Robert McFerrin. What makes this casting choice even more interesting is that Robert McFerrin was the father of Bobby McFerrin, who would go on to become famous decades later for his hit song Don't Worry, Be Happy in the 1980s. The dubbing process required careful coordination between Poitier and McFerrin to make the performance feel authentic and believable on screen. According to an article in Life magazine at the time, The two men worked closely together to blend their talents and create a unified character. McFerrin explained that they had to get to know Porgy as a person first, saying it couldn't just be Poitier the actor or McFerrin the singer working separately, but had to be Porgy as a complete blend of both their contributions. Dorothy Dandridge, who played Bess opposite Poitier's Porgy, also had her singing voice dubbed, despite the fact that she was actually a trained and capable singer in her own right. Her vocals were provided by opera singer Adele Addison throughout the film. The filmmakers made this decision because they felt Dandridge's natural soprano voice wouldn't match well with McFerrin's rich baritone when they sang their duets together, and they wanted the vocal pairing to sound harmonious and balanced from an operatic standpoint rather than using the actors' real voices. Fact 4. It was almost made in blackface with white stars. Long before the 1959 version of Porgy and Bess ever made it to the screen, the film rights to the beloved Gershwin opera had a deeply troubling history that nearly resulted in one of the most offensive casting decisions in Hollywood history. Back in 1942, Columbia Pictures purchased the film rights with a shocking plan to cast the movie with an entirely white ensemble of actors who would perform the story in blackface makeup. The studio had already selected their dream cast for this version, with legendary performer Al Jolson set to play the lead role of Porgy, glamorous actress Rita Hayworth chosen to portray Bess, and the iconic dancer Fred Astaire tapped to bring the character of Sportin' Life to life. This casting approach would have been absolutely catastrophic for the legacy of Gershwin's work, reducing a powerful story about black life, and struggled to a minstrel show spectacle performed by white actors in dark makeup. Thankfully, the Gershwin estate, which controlled the rights to the music and had final approval over how the opera could be adapted, was horrified by this proposal and refused to allow it to move forward. They vehemently opposed the idea and blocked Columbia Pictures from proceeding with their blackface version, making it clear that this was not an acceptable way to bring Porgy and Bess to the screen. After Columbia's plan was rejected, the property eventually moved to 20th Century Fox, where there were hopes it could be developed as a follow-up to the successful all-black cast film Stormy Weather from 1943. However, that version also failed to come together, and the film rights would remain in limbo for many more years before Samuel Goldwyn finally purchased them in 1957. Fact 5. Sammy Davis Jr. only got cast after Frank Sinatra intervened. Sammy Davis Jr. desperately wanted to be part of Porgy and Bess and saw the role of Sportin' Life as a perfect opportunity to showcase his talents in a major Hollywood production, but producer Samuel Goldwyn had absolutely no interest in casting him and actively worked to keep him out of the film. Davis arranged to audition for the role during a party at Judy Garland's home, hoping to impress the decision-makers with his performance. Unfortunately for Davis, Ira Gershwin's wife Lee was present at this audition, and she was completely horrified by what she considered to be Davis's vulgar behavior and performance style during his tryout. Lee Gershwin immediately approached Goldwyn and made him promise on his life that he would never cast Sammy Davis Jr. in the film, and Goldwyn was more than happy to agree with her assessment. In fact, Goldwyn's feelings toward Davis were even worse than simple disapproval, as he reportedly referred to the talented entertainer using a deeply racist slur, calling him "that monkey" behind his back. With Goldwyn firmly against him, the producer offered the role of Sportin' Life to the legendary performer Cab Calloway instead, assuming that would be the end of the matter. However, when Cab Calloway turned down the role and declined to be part of the production, Davis saw another opportunity and decided to call in reinforcements from his powerful friends in Hollywood. He reached out to Frank Sinatra, his fellow member of the famous Rat Pack, and asked for help getting the part. Sinatra, along with some of his associates, put significant pressure on Samuel Goldwyn to reconsider his decision and give Davis the role he wanted so badly. The pressure campaign worked, and Goldwyn finally relented, announcing to Davis that the part was his after all. Fact 6. Pearl Bailey refused to wear a bandana. Pearl Bailey, who was cast to play the character of Maria in the film, had serious concerns about how black women would be portrayed in the production and made her position crystal clear from the very beginning of her involvement with the project. Before she would even agree to take the role, Bailey sat down with costume designer Irene Sharaf and gave her a firm warning that under no circumstances would she wear a bandana as part of her costume. Bailey felt strongly that bandanas were deeply associated with the Aunt Jemima stereotype, a racist caricature that had been used for decades to portray black women as subservient domestic workers, and she was absolutely determined not to contribute to perpetuating that harmful image on screen. Sharaf apparently agreed to Bailey's demands during their private conversation, but when it came time for the first costume review with the entire women's chorus, Bailey discovered that the costume department had outfitted many of the other actresses with bandanas as part of their period-appropriate wardrobe for the film. Bailey was furious when she saw this and refused to let it stand, even though the bandanas weren't meant for her own costume. She immediately created a massive scene during the review, screaming at the top of her lungs that no one was going to wear a bandana in any picture she was part of, making it clear that this wasn't just about her personal costume, but about the dignity and representation of all the black women in the cast. Bailey's passionate stand during that costume review forced the production team to rethink their approach to the costumes and remove the offensive elements that she had objected to so strongly, showing that she was willing to use her position and voice to fight against stereotypical portrayals. Fact 7. The film was canceled in Atlanta after angering black viewers. After Porgy and Bess opened in major cities like New York and Los Angeles on a reserved seat basis during the summer of 1959, the film made its way to Atlanta in early August, for what should have been a standard theatrical run in the southern city. However, the Atlanta engagement turned into a public relations disaster when black viewers who came to see the film reacted with anger and outrage to how their community was being portrayed on screen. The negative reaction was so intense and the controversy so immediate that the theater was forced to cancel the film's run in Atlanta shortly after it had opened, pulling it from screens much earlier than planned. The situation became even more complicated when the Atlanta Journal newspaper published accusations claiming that producer Samuel Goldwyn himself was censoring his own film in response to the backlash from black audiences. These allegations suggested that Goldwyn was making cuts or changes to the movie to try to address the complaints, though the exact nature of any supposed censorship was never clearly established. Rather than fighting these accusations or trying to defend the film and keep it in theaters, Goldwyn made the decision to pull Porgy and Bess from several other areas throughout the country as well, seemingly in an attempt to avoid further controversy and negative publicity. This was a remarkable turn of events for such an expensive and high-profile production, especially considering that the film had actually been performing quite well at the box office in other markets. Despite the Atlanta cancellation and the subsequent pullback in other regions, Porgy and Bess still managed to rank as the fourth highest-grossing film in the United States during August of 1959, showing that there was clearly an audience for the movie even as it faced significant opposition. Fact 8. Leontyne Price turned down dubbing with "No Body, No Voice." When producer Samuel Goldwyn was searching for the perfect operatic voice to dub Dorothy Dandridge's singing in the role of Bess, he naturally thought of Leontyne Price, one of the most celebrated opera singers of her generation, who had already made a name for herself performing the role of Bess in stage productions of the opera. Price had starred in the 1952 revival of Porgy and Bess that toured throughout the United States and Europe, earning widespread acclaim for her powerful and moving interpretation of the character. Her connection to the role and her extraordinary vocal abilities made her seem like an obvious choice to provide the singing voice for the film version. However, when Goldwyn approached Price with his offer to have her voice featured in the movie while Dorothy Dandridge appeared on screen, the opera star gave him a response that was both brief and unforgettable. Price told Goldwyn in no uncertain terms, "No body, no voice." With this simple four-word statement, she made it abundantly clear that she had no interest in being just a disembodied voice for someone else's performance. If Goldwyn wanted her magnificent singing to be part of his film, he would need to cast her in the actual role of Bess so that audiences could see her face and body along with hearing her voice. Price's refusal to participate as merely a voice performer was a powerful statement about her worth as an artist and her refusal to be separated from her own artistry. She understood that being reduced to an invisible vocal contribution would diminish her standing and deny audiences the full experience of her performance. Goldwyn ultimately went with Adele Addison to provide the singing voice for Dorothy Dandridge instead. Fact 9. Sammy Davis Jr.'s voice isn't on the soundtrack album. Sammy Davis Jr. was one of the few principal cast members who actually performed his own singing in the film, bringing his incredible vocal talents to the role of Sportin' Life and delivering some of the most memorable musical numbers in the entire production. However, when Columbia Records released the official soundtrack album for Porgy and Bess, audiences who purchased it expecting to hear Davis's performance were in for a confusing surprise. Due to contractual obligations that Davis had already signed with Decca Records, which was a competing record label, Columbia was legally prohibited from using his vocal recordings on their soundtrack release. Rather than leaving those songs off the album entirely or trying to work out some kind of complicated licensing agreement between the two record companies, Columbia made the decision to bring in another performer to re-record all of Sportin' Life's musical numbers specifically for the soundtrack album. They chose Cab Calloway, himself a legendary entertainer who had previously played Sportin' Life in stage productions of the opera, to step in and sing the songs to the same orchestral and choral tracks that had been used in the film. Calloway's versions were then placed on the album in place of Davis's actual film performances. This created a strange situation where people who saw the movie heard Sammy Davis Jr. singing, but anyone who bought the soundtrack album heard Cab Calloway instead, even though the album was supposedly a recording of the film's music. To make matters even more confusing, Davis's name was prominently featured on the back of the album cover, leading many listeners over the years to mistakenly believe they were hearing Davis when they were actually listening to Calloway's substitute recordings. Fact 10. The director sabotaged editing with long takes. Otto Preminger was well aware of Samuel Goldwyn's reputation throughout Hollywood as a producer who loved to meddle extensively during the editing process, often completely reworking a director's vision by rearranging scenes and changing the flow of the film to match his own ideas about how the story should be told. Preminger had no interest in allowing Goldwyn to take control of the editing room and reshape his work, so he came up with a clever but risky strategy to protect his creative vision from the producer's interference. Instead of shooting scenes in the traditional way with multiple camera angles and plenty of extra coverage footage that could be cut together in different ways, Preminger deliberately chose to film almost the entire movie using long, continuous takes with very few close-ups and minimal alternative angles. By shooting in this distinctive style with the camera panning in and out during extended shots where the camera angles rarely changed, Preminger effectively removed Goldwyn's ability to manipulate the footage during editing. There simply wasn't enough extra material for the producer to work with if he wanted to restructure scenes or insert his own ideas about how moments should be presented. This approach gave Preminger complete control over the final product and ensured that his vision would remain intact, but it came with significant consequences for how the film was received by audiences and critics. Many reviewers found that Preminger's long-take shooting style made the movie feel static and stagey, with Time magazine describing it as suffering from cinematic monotony and other critics complaining that it felt more like a photographed stage production rather than a true motion picture that took advantage of the medium's possibilities. Fact 11. It was Samuel Goldwyn's last film, and a financial disaster. Porgy and Bess held special significance for producer Samuel Goldwyn because it turned out to be the final film project of his long and legendary career in Hollywood, marking the end of an era for one of the industry's most influential figures. Goldwyn had been dreaming about bringing the Gershwin opera to the screen ever since he first saw it performed on stage back in 1935, and he poured enormous resources and energy into making the film adaptation a reality. The production carried a massive budget of $7 million, which was an extraordinary amount of money for a film at that time, and represented a huge financial gamble for the aging producer. Despite the film's troubled production history and mixed critical reception, Porgy and Bess actually performed reasonably well at the box office during its initial theatrical run. The movie ranked as the fourth highest-grossing film in the United States during August of 1959 and maintained strong positions in the top 10 for several months afterward, climbing as high as second place in November before gradually declining in the following months. However, even with these seemingly impressive box office rankings, the film failed to generate enough revenue to justify its enormous production costs, ultimately earning back only half of its $7 million budget from ticket sales in the United States and Canada. The disappointing financial performance clearly weighed heavily on Goldwyn, and just 2 months after the film's release, he made a remarkably candid and somewhat bitter admission about how the project had been received. In a moment of unusual vulnerability, the legendary producer grudgingly conceded to the press that "no one is waiting breathlessly for my next picture," acknowledging that his final film had not lived up to his hopes. Fact 12. The Gershwin estate called it a piece of shit. The Gershwin family's hatred of the 1959 film adaptation of Porgy and Bess was so intense and visceral that it would ultimately determine the fate of the movie for decades to come. Ira Gershwin, who had written the lyrics for the original opera alongside his late brother George, and author Dubose Hayward, was deeply unhappy with how Samuel Goldwyn had handled the film adaptation. According to Michael Strunsky, who served as trustee and executor of the Ira Gershwin musical estate and was also the nephew of Ira's wife Leonore, both Ira and Leonore viewed the finished film with complete contempt and reportedly described it using extremely harsh language, calling it a piece of garbage that had betrayed the integrity of the original work. The Gershwins felt that Goldwyn had glamorized and over-Hollywoodized their brother's masterpiece, stripping away its authenticity and turning it into something cheap and commercial, rather than preserving the artistic vision that had made the opera so powerful and meaningful. They were particularly angry about Goldwyn's decision to fire the original director Rouben Mamoulian, who had successfully staged the 1935 Broadway premiere, and they believed the extensive cuts to the music and changes to the orchestrations had damaged the work beyond repair. According to reports, Ira Gershwin and Leonore actually directed Goldwyn to destroy all remaining prints of the film 20 years after its release, exercising their contractual rights to control what happened to the adaptation of their family's work. When Goldwyn's distribution rights expired in 1974, the Gershwin estate took control and kept the film locked away from public view, rarely allowing it to be screened anywhere. Fact 13. It's never been released on home video. In what has to be one of the strangest situations in Hollywood history, the 1959 version of Porgy and Bess has never been officially released in any home video format whatsoever, making it completely unavailable for legal purchase or rental by the general public. There has never been a VHS release, never a DVD release, never a Blu-ray release, and the film is not available on any streaming platforms either. This makes Porgy and Bess incredibly unusual for a major Hollywood production that featured such an impressive cast of talented performers and was produced by one of the industry's most legendary figures. The absence of any official home video release is particularly striking given the film's recognition by the United States Library of Congress, which selected Porgy and Bess for preservation in the National Film Registry in 2011. This prestigious honor is reserved for films that are deemed to be culturally, historically, or aesthetically significant to American cinema, and the Library of Congress specifically described the movie as an overlooked masterpiece that deserved to be preserved for future generations. Despite this official acknowledgement of the film's importance and value, the complex rights issues and the Gershwin estate's continuing objections to the film have prevented it from ever becoming commercially available to audiences. For people who desperately want to see the movie, the only options have been to track down poor-quality bootleg copies that circulate online or on physical media like DVD-R discs, typically made from old 16mm prints or deteriorated copies with faded colors and damaged sound. Film historians and archivists have called it the holy grail of unavailable films, and some experts question whether a complete, high-quality print even still exists anywhere. Fact 14. It only aired on network TV. Once in 1967, for a major Hollywood production that cost $7 million and featured some of the biggest stars in entertainment, Porgy and Bess has had an incredibly limited television history that seems almost impossible to believe. The film was broadcast on national network television exactly one time in its entire existence, airing as the ABC Sunday Night Movie on March 5, 1967. This single television showing occurred roughly 8 years after the film's original theatrical release, during a week that also featured a rebroadcast of a television adaptation of the musical Brigadoon and the very first broadcast of Hal Holbrook's celebrated one-man show Mark Twain Tonight, making it a particularly notable week for musical entertainment on television. After that lone 1967 broadcast, Porgy and Bess completely disappeared from network television and has never been shown again in its entirety on any major television network. The film did have multiple presentations during the 1970s on KTLA-TV Channel 5, an independent station in Los Angeles that had access to the Samuel Goldwyn Studios output and could broadcast films from the Goldwyn Library. However, these local broadcasts were limited to the Los Angeles area and didn't reach national audiences across the country. Since the 1970s, the only glimpses of Porgy and Bess that television audiences have been able to see are brief clips that have occasionally appeared during American Film Institute specials and retrospectives about classic Hollywood cinema. These short excerpts are typically just a few seconds or minutes long, and give viewers only the smallest taste of the full film. This extraordinarily limited availability has transformed Porgy and Bess into one of Hollywood's most elusive so-called lost films. Fact 15. Dorothy Dandridge's singing voice didn't match on purpose. Dorothy Dandridge was already a well-established and accomplished singer by the time she was cast as Bess in the 1959 film, having demonstrated her vocal abilities in numerous previous performances throughout her career in nightclubs, on recordings, and in other films. Unlike Sidney Poitier, who genuinely could not sing operatically and clearly needed his voice to be dubbed for the demanding musical requirements of the role, Dandridge actually possessed the training and talent necessary to handle the singing herself. However, the filmmakers made the surprising decision to dub her voice anyway, even though she was perfectly capable of performing the songs. The reason behind this unusual choice had nothing to do with Dandridge's singing abilities, and everything to do with the complex vocal matching decisions that had already been made for the other characters. Since Sidney Poitier's singing voice was being dubbed by opera singer Robert McFerrin, who had a rich and deep baritone voice, the filmmakers became concerned about how Dandridge's natural soprano voice would sound when paired with McFerrin's much lower vocal range during the romantic duets between Porgy and Bess. They felt that the contrast between a high soprano and a low baritone would create an imbalanced and unharmonious sound that wouldn't work well from an operatic standpoint. To solve this perceived problem, the production team brought in opera singer Adele Addison to provide the singing voice for Bess throughout the entire film. This decision meant that Dorothy Dandridge, despite being a talented vocalist in her own right, never got to use her own voice in any of the musical numbers, with her actual singing talents completely set aside in favor of achieving what the filmmakers believed would be better vocal harmony.